and welcome once again to the Bret Chat Sport or BCS Podcast. Next week marks 1 year since I started this show. The premise of this podcast from the very beginning has always been a British guy speaking with a guest predominantly about American sports and American sports fandom. Or, as you've seen with some episodes, I'll feature multiple contributors who again will predominantly be talking about American sports. And it has to be said, the majority of the time, those guests are British, because I recognise that we, as Brits, can offer a different perspective on those American sports, and I certainly hope that it's interesting for people on both sides of the Atlantic to listen to. It has to be said though, this podcast has always been enriched by also featuring American guests as well. With that in mind, to mark the 1 year anniversary of this podcast starting, this episode will be a study of UK versus US sports fandom. To help me with this, I brought in two people who can offer unique perspectives. Bret Griffin, who is an American that now lives in the UK, and Ross Worsley, a British expat who has now lived in the United States for nearly a decade. I started by asking both what they thought the differences were between UK and US sports fandom.
I think US fans tend to be almost more casual fans of a lot wider sports. Like whenever I have conversations with other Americans, inevitably we start talking about sports and we talk about a much wider variety of sports. Like I would say my favorite sport's baseball, but I'm also a big fan of football. I like hockey. Depending on who's having a successful year, I might watch a bit of basketball. Here in the UK, I like to watch rugby as well. So there's a bit of a broader perspective. One of the things that I found surprising when I moved here was how people were fans of a sport, and that was their kind of main sport. So I guess the two big ones would have been kind of soccer and rugby. So for instance, when I first started working in the UK and we had all these little fun icebreakers you do your first week, there was a group of us for induction, and it turned to sports a little bit. There was a group of 4 or 5 who were soccer fans, absolutely obsessed with it, knew all about it. And then there was another one who was a rugby fan. It was like the soccer fans were soccer fans. They only did soccer. And the rugby fan was a rugby fan, didn't pay any attention to the others. So I think there's a lot more crossover in terms of US sports fans just being, I guess, following a wider variety of sports.
To the UK, the biggest difference, I think, is like each city have more sports teams, I guess, that people support. It tends to be mostly, soccer in the UK that you follow. That's your team. You're from the city you're from. Whereas in the US, if you're from, say, New York, you're going to be like either Giants or Jets or your Knicks or the Nets, and you get Mets and Yankees, and you kind of have, a few teams that they're passionate about for each sport. So I think probably like a bit less passionate about certain teams than the UK. So, for example, when I lived in the UK and would follow, my team or dad's team growing up, very, going to watch them every week, I wasn't really supporting any other sports teams, just that was the main focus. Whereas here it seems to be quite a big, every sport you've got to pick a team, and then each season when it comes around you follow them, and that's like quite the different sort of atmosphere. It's not quite as passionate. It's more focused on the sort of entertainment side rather than the sports side. So,
and how do you think that translates to the atmosphere in a UK football stadium versus a US football stadium or a basketball arena, say?
Yeah, it's different. Like there's no segregation, fans. You kind of, if you go to watch a team play, I went to Las Vegas to see the Giants and the Raiders, at the Raiders Stadium. You just kind of sit with the Raiders fans and everyone has, a good time. There's not much, animosity. I think there's certain games, if you went, say, like Eagles, Giants, in Philadelphia, as a Giants fan, you probably wouldn't go to that, just because it's a bit more, there's a little bit more animosity, I guess. But most of the time, so it's a bit more of, an enjoyable experience. There's not as much worry going to the game of stuff happening beforehand, and it makes for a little bit more of a better day out, I think, than going to a football game in the UK, especially if you have to get sort of led to the stadium by the police and all that sort of stuff that happens there. It kind of, here it's a little bit more of a better day out, a bit more of a, experience, I think.
I only found this out within the last year. So I've been here in the UK for about 18 years. Never realized until last year that at soccer games, I don't know if it's all stadiums, but certainly for a number of stadiums, that away supporters have their own section, or in some cases just aren't allowed at all. So I think that was probably one of the shocking in-stadium things to me, is that there's not as much integration of the fans for different teams. So I think partly that sort of more casual nature of being a wide variety of sports fans in the US, you're not necessarily wholly invested. You're still invested in your teams, but not to the point that it's life or death for that one team.
I wanted to get a broader perspective on these issues, though, and so here is what friend of the show, Dr. Mimi Febo, who is originally from Kansas City but now lives in Bristol in the south of England, had to say on the differences between UK and US sports fandom.
The saying "go big or go home" very much applies to UK fandom. UK fans are kind of grilled when they out themselves as a fan, and lots of statistics and information are necessary to be believed as a proper fan. There are no casual fandoms, and I think that kind of intense interest is very much starting to come into the NFL, and true fans are going to know, somebody's combine scores, or have a mock draft ready for their team. But in the UK, that's very pervasive. You would expect a true fan to be up on all the latest news and gossip.
I found it really interesting that both Bret and Ross felt the need to raise that fans in the US tend to support teams across all of the major sports leagues, whereas fans in the UK tend to focus more on just one team. I then followed up with both by stating my view that sports fandom in the UK tends to be more tribal. Here is what Bret Griffin had to say in response.
Certainly in the US, there's an element of that as well, that people are absolutely invested in their teams. But I think there's a bit more of a focus on that is your kind of one team in the UK to some extent. Is if you're a soccer fan, you're going to have that. And because you're not necessarily mixing and matching with other sports, your identity becomes much more as a fan of that one team. Whereas from US sports, I switch every other day depending on what sports are on that.
And here is Ross Worsley's view.
Yeah, I think that's, like I was saying, because people have just one team they're focusing on a bit more, and that's, they're much more passionate pride, of where they're from and that team. Here, I think it's more, about the team itself, the players, and the ownership of the team, and it's, a franchise a lot of the times, so there's a possibility it's not going to stay in your city. Most of them do, but, there's some like the Rams and the Raiders which get moved around. So you've got that chance. So, there's not quite the same tribalism around the team, because you've also realised that, it's owned to make money rather than to, get promoted. And I think the league system, how there isn't really promotion relegation, and there's playoffs and that side of things, kind of there's a focus on the team rather than, the other teams and the rivalries and stuff like that. It's more a focus on performance of your own team, so you're not quite as there's not as much animosity, I guess, against other teams as there is in the UK.
Something I find quite striking as a Brit is how popular college sports are in the US. Here is what my fellow Brit, Ross Worsley, had to say following nearly a decade of living in the US.
Here, yeah, it's massive. So, like you were saying, if you'd go and watch Lancaster play football, it would be, sort of 5 people, whereas, Ohio State will get like 100,000 fans in the stadium for their, college football games. But it took me, even after moving here, it took me a couple of years to grasp the college game, because there's so many teams and so many different players that you have to try and keep up with. But once you get into it, it's really kind of hooks you in, because you want to see the next, person who might come through, the next best player. And I think that's what attracts people to watching it, is because they want to, the draft system, the way that works, here compared to, just there's not really a youth setup at the teams themselves. The youth setup really is the college game, so that people have to watch to see who the next best player is going to be. And there is some big rivalries, in that as well. So if you're from, Michigan, you're going to hate, Ohio State because of the rivalries between those states. And there's, that side draws people in. And then obviously if you have children that go to certain colleges, you become a fan of them. And then all of that combined means there's a ton of people who want to watch it.
And here is what our American friend Bret Griffin had to say about why college sports are so popular in the US.
I think one of the differences that's going to be a big difference for that is the regional versus national nature of the sports. So I'm from Oklahoma. I've got my Oklahoma shirt on. That's where I went to university. Diehard fan of Oklahoma. That is the local team. Absolutely dominates the local news coverage. The local sports coverage is very much Oklahoma football. If you were to ask me if you were going to Oklahoma, what should you do? We don't have a ton of stuff in this state, to be honest. It's not a big state. We've got two relatively mid-sized cities. So I'd say go see an Oklahoma football game. That's the kind of most exciting thing there.
This is something where I have to agree with Ross. As Ross alluded to in his answer, he and I went to university together. And we knew a couple of the guys who were on the university's rugby union team. And it has to be said, one of them then went on to play semi-professionally in the UK at a pretty decent level. There were never more than about 150 to 200 people at any of those rugby games though. And we weren't in a fancy stand, we were stood a little bit away from the rugby pitch on a hill near to where that rugby pitch was. And it has to be said, that rugby pitch was not the best kept rugby pitch in the world either. Ultimately, university sports in this country are very much an add-on to your studies. Unless you are going to a university in the UK like Loughborough University, which is known for its sports programmes, you are not playing sports at university because your aim is to then have a career in that sport. Chanting is something that is very specific at UK sports fixtures, particularly at what I would call football games, although it does also occur at rugby and cricket games too. Here's what Mimi Febo had to say on this issue.
The way British fans react to the game vocally is very interesting, and terrace chants are chants that start off grassroots. It's not something that you learn from a cheerleader or are, flashed out on the Jumbotron or anything. They arise from the crowd. And the singing on the terraces is really amazing, and it's a fun thing to be part of. And there's a strong chant that people use in football. It's called "Sing When You're Winning." And it goes, sing when you're winning, you only sing when you're winning. And the idea is that you are part of your team and you are proud of your team and you're proud of being who you are.
And here are Bret Griffin's thoughts when it comes to chanting in the UK at sports fixtures.
One of the other differences I find in sports is singing. There seems to be a lot of singing in UK sports, whereas you do not get that in US sports, except for college sports. It's the one place where there's like singing and you have the band out.
Finally, as our discussion continues, Bret Griffin made a fantastic point about sports being screened in a variety of social settings in the US.
I think one of the big differences in terms of pub culture that plays out is within the US, sports are just, I find, everywhere. I think sports are a much, dare I say, bigger part of US culture in some ways. Like you grow up around it, it's just constantly everywhere. So if I go to any bar in the US or even just a casual sit-down restaurant, maybe not a fast food restaurant, but any restaurant where you're going to sit down and have a meal or any place you're going to be sat down for a while, there's almost always a TV on that's got ESPN on the screen and maybe a few other screens with whatever big games are happening. I think the US is almost sports bar, sports restaurant, just everywhere, much more prevalent. And it's on, it's there, it's what you see. You don't have to hunt it out. And also I guess one difference as well there is that When I think about it from a US perspective, it tends to be a lot more family-oriented places as well. So it's not necessarily that you need to go to a sports bar to watch a place. You can go to a restaurant, which will have the game on. And you can take the family, you can take the kids, everyone will sit there, watch the game. Whereas from a UK perspective, it is much more of a pub where it's going to be only adults in the pub. You're not going to see kids around in the pubs. It's going to be people who are older and drinking. It's a little bit of a different atmosphere for it as well. Whereas again, I think that family nature of the US, where I know the question is more about sports bar, but you can go to the restaurant that has a restaurant and bar area as well. It's quite common to see people out watching a game where it's more of a family atmosphere as well. And that makes it a little bit more casual, I think, too.
On this, Mimi Febo also had some points to add regarding the violence that can occur at UK pubs during sports fixtures.
I think it's a very, sports has taken the place of, ritual fighting, and it is very kind of tribal. It's part of what we need. We seem to need representatives of our own struggles to love and representatives of our own struggles to hate, and that's really obvious in the UK, perhaps because it's so tightly keyed to individual identity and personality, and also the beer is a lot stronger and comes in bigger glasses, and people put a lot of it away. The drinking culture is quite strong in the UK. So, yes, it often does feel a little bit, there's pubs and pubs, there are supporters pubs where you would not go in with a rival's jersey on your back, or even walk on the streets nearby. And then there's village pubs where, everybody might know each other, and there might be 5 different jerseys in the pub that night. So it's pubs and pubs. Sports bars are generally a little bit friendlier and more tolerant, and less about getting, really hammered than a UK pub. Both are potentially very misogynist places. So as a woman, I'm always really aware that I'm surrounded by a bunch of men who are drinking quite heavily. So yeah, there is more of an edge to walking in to a pub in the UK, especially one that you don't know, to watch a match.
And I have to say, I agree with Bret wholeheartedly on that point. Sports do tend to be screened more widely and are more widely available in public settings in the US. Meanwhile, probably because sports fandom is more tribal in the UK, you can only really get to see football and rugby games in a public setting in the UK in pubs, and those pubs are very much divided along tribal lines as well. If you go into Manchester city centre, there are pubs that are designated as only being for Man United fans, and then there are other pubs that are designated as being for Man City fans only. And that creates what can be a very hostile atmosphere at times. I cannot remember the last time I went and watched any kind of a sports fixture in a pub in the UK, precisely because there can be that risk of things kicking off, as we would say in this country. And quite frankly, I don't want to watch sports and there be a risk of that. I watch sports because I want to enjoy them, and I want to relax by watching sports, not be on my guard because something might potentially kick off on the other side of the bar because someone said the wrong thing. Contrast that with America, and one of the things that I really like when I visit America is that I know that I can go out in the evening, go to a bar or a casual restaurant, get some good food, and whatever sport is on that night will be on the screens there, and I can watch that sport and I can have a pleasant conversation with anyone else who might be sat at that bar about that game. And all of this speaks to the point that both Bret and Ross made at the start of this episode. Fans in the US do tend to spread their fandom across a range of teams, whereas fans in the UK do seem to be more focused on just one sport. If you are a fan of football in this country, and by football I mean what the Americans would call soccer, you are a football fan first and foremost. Similarly, if you are a fan of rugby league, you are not only a fan of rugby league first and foremost, but you also consider rugby union to be an inferior form of that sport, in the same way that rugby union fans are not only rugby union fans first and foremost, but they consider rugby league to be an inferior form of the sport that only people with accents like mine play. And a lot of that is down to the ongoing class problems that we have in this country. Ultimately, sports can be both a unifier and a divider. As much as sports do seem to be less tribal in the US, they are still fervent fans of their teams, and that is absolutely to be commended, because it's something that adds joy to their life in an extra dimension. For now though, that is the end of this episode of the BCS Podcast. Thank you very much for joining me, and I certainly do hope to see you again next time. Bye bye now. The BCS Podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Boris Anderoff and Pixabay for the use of the music and sound effects in this podcast. This week's episode features contributions from Bret Griffin, Ross Worsley and Dr. Mimi Febo.